Book of James, chapter 2, verse 14 through 26. Scripture will be on the screen as usual here and also on the stream. And I invite you to read along with me as we read God's word together. James, chapter 2, verse 14 through 26. Let's read God's word together. What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that God is one. You do well. The demons also believe and shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac, his son, on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says that Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. In the same way was not Rahab the harlot also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. This section of James is one that basically needs no introduction, and if you are familiar with it, you might have been waiting for this one since we began this series. And this is because if you spent any considerable time in and around the church and therefore Christians, you're probably well aware and familiar with this passage. It's faith and works. Faith without works, as James says, is dead faith. I think this is by far the most well-known passage here in James, and also the most controversial and therefore the most discussed passage in James, it seems to me. And at the heart of the issue and the controversy are basically two things. One is James suggesting that you can earn your faith, right? That works are so important that you can earn it, right? Work for it somehow. And then the second thing that's most controversial is, wait, didn't Paul say that you are justified by faith alone and not by works? Then aren't James and Paul contradicting one another? And I will say these controversies or these discussions are really worth discussing, but just not today. Because I think if we tried to do so, we would never get to the text at the heart of what we're reading. And so we can't do both and do them well. So I will choose not to discuss that here on this Sunday during this sermon. But if you are willing and wanting to talk to me about those things, we can anytime have that discussion. So if you would let me know, then I will go ahead and will definitely be eager and willing to discuss that with you. But let me say, just for some of you that are interested, if you're like, I wonder what Pastor Pete thinks, probably don't. But if you are one of those folks, let me say, I do not believe that Paul and James contradict one another. It centers on their use of the word justification and so on and so forth. And so I think they work in tandem. But again, if you want to dig into that a little bit further, let me know, and I'd be happy to do so with you. So today, rather than that, we're going to focus on the crux of James's argument and what he is saying, which I think in many ways is perhaps the critical and most pivotal section of his letter, maybe. That this is a really, really, really important one to understand. I also want to focus on the crux of his argument because my experience with this passage in many ways in the church is it's been used to kind of divide and kind of justify different things within the church, and I want to hope that it's not used to do so, right? We have an understanding of this passage, and I think the way that we've used it in the church, again, my experience is that we've kind of used it to divide folks here and the have-nots and whatnot, and I don't think James is trying to do that, and I think sometimes we miss out on the particularities of what he's saying. Like we take verse 14 and then we kind of blow that up, but we don't consider the rest of the section, and I think we need to do that to do good faith work in this section. So we're going to really dig into the nitty-gritty of what James is arguing. And he writes this section, to be clear, because this section is a continuation of all of chapter 2. This is not a separate section. This is a continuation of chapter 2. We noted a few weeks ago that chapter 2 begins the second half of the letter, and in chapters 2 through 5, James highlights 3 fundamental characteristics of a Christian: godly speech, care for the poor and the helpless, and holiness. And through these 3 characteristics, we mentioned a couple weeks ago that you're going to be able to see signs and or sins, right, within yourself. That when you look within, when you allow these characteristics to shine a light on your life, you're either going to see signs of a faith that works or sins of a wicked inside job hearts, as we've been calling it throughout the series. And in our section today, we're continuing that same theme of caring for the poor and the helpless, as you will see. But more so than just continuing it, we're getting to what I call the climax of James's argument, or the grand opus, if you will, of not only this theme, but I think the whole letter up until this point. James boldly and clearly states, faith without works, it's useless. Even more, it's dead. This is like the epitome or the end goal of hearing and not doing, or looking intently and forgetting, or the double-minded thing. This is taking it furthest to its end and saying emphatically, this is what it means to have a faith that does not work. Now, if you felt throughout this series that James's language has been strong, you're right, he is quite strong. Last week we noted that what he was saying in the section from 8 to 13 is kind of a gut punch. Well, if that's the case, then today is not just a gut punch, it's the knockout punch. His argument goes for the gusto, it's robust, it's emphatic, and also it's brilliant in the way that he writes it. It's a doozy, and we want to make sure we unpack it so that we understand in depth what he's trying to say. Okay? So again, if you would like to discuss some of the other stuff, let me know. Happy to do so, but today we're going to get into the text and really dive into what James is saying. So here's the game plan. First, what is James saying? What's the main argument? Second, how does he prove his point? The 4 illustrations he gives. And then third, why and how does this matter, right? What does it do for my life? The practical implications of what James is writing. So we're going to go through those. First, the main argument. Here's what James is trying to say, in my opinion. In verse 14, he lays it out plainly. He goes, "What use is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him?" Right off the bat, he makes it clear what his issue is. In those days, there were people in the church that claimed they had faith with their lips, but yet who were not living it out in any discernible or observable way. This is a classic, someone who talks a big game, but they never back it up. It's the kid on the playground who says, yeah, I'm faster than you and I can beat you in a race. Or you know what, I can make that shot, I can make a better shot than you. Or I can throw the ball further than you, whatever. And then someone goes, yeah, prove it, I can beat you in a race. And then all of a sudden, they're like nowhere to be found. Where'd they go? In church, in many ways, it could be someone who maybe looks the part, dresses appropriately, knows how to worship, knows all the biblical answers because they've grown up in the church. But when you actually take a look at that person's life, there may not be discernible signs of true faith. Things like forgiveness that's difficult, generosity, reconciliation, a private prayer life, etc. These are often what's been called Sunday-only Christians for a while, and James is saying that kind of faith, clearly, can that faith save him? That's the question. And this question is a loaded one. I think you can tell right off the bat, because it implies 2 very important things we have to square. One, it's questioning, does that type of faith even exist? Because people claimed it did. But second, and more importantly, James is saying, even if it did, does that type of faith save you? And to both, James emphatically says, no. Twice he says in verse 14 and 16, what use is it? Another way to put it is, what good does that do? It literally in Greek is, what does it profit anyone? Again, even if that faith existed, let's say, what good does it do you? And he would say, certainly that kind of faith cannot save you from the punishment of sin and death. Now, the way that he writes the rest of this section in particular, we can assume that this was an argument and a discussion that was happening in the church. And people would have had their rebuttals, their retorts at James when he would say, faith without works is useless and or dead. And so, because they had their retorts, then James quickly and clearly comes up with an example to make sure nobody's confused as to what he's talking about. In verse 15 and on, he gives an example, and here's the example. He says, here's what I'm talking about. Say that there is a brother and or a sister, a fellow Christian, a fellow believer. Now, we have to mention that James is explicit to mention both genders, a male believer and a female believer. He's one of the few New Testament writers that explicitly mentions both. I think it's significant. I think it's perhaps to make sure that poor female believers who would have been disproportionately not taken care of by the church don't get excluded. So I think that's important. But beyond that, he's saying there's a fellow believer, fellow brother and or sister, and they clearly are without clothing and in need of daily food. Now, to say without clothing here in the Greek literally means naked in many ways, or it most likely means without appropriate clothing or sufficient clothing. So think of someone who does not have the clothing to survive a winter. We don't have a winter here in Houston, but I know some folks, like Mario's from Minnesota, they have brutal winters over there. And imagine somebody that does not have the clothes to survive the winter. That's what we're talking about without clothing. The without daily food is literally in the Greek, food for the day, without food for the day. And not just one day or one day here and there, but basically every day. This is someone who does not have enough food to live on day after day. The description is clear in the Greek. It's someone who is very desperate and in a desolate situation. It's the destitute poor of the world. Okay? So then he says, you see, as a Christian, someone who claims to have faith, but has no works. You see, you acknowledge, and you recognize without a shadow of a doubt the situation and need, and yet you do nothing about it. And James is asking, well, then does this person and this type of faith and that claim, does it save? Now we know, without a shadow of a doubt again, that this person has seen and acknowledged the need. It's not that they haven't seen it. Why? Because they address it. They speak to it. The person addresses said fellow Christian brother and or sister, and they address it. Now, if you're wondering, how do they know that that person is a Christian? Not that that matters all that much, but how do they know? In those days, they would have definitively known. Today is difficult. You can't just look at a person and be like, oh, Christian, not Christian. Can't do that today. But in those days, they would have known. The community of the Christian church was such that they knew who were their brothers and their sisters, right? Christians were persecuted in those days, largely based on faith, and so they knew who they were talking about. So that was also not in question. And so, again, Christian claims to have faith, sees a fellow Christian brother and or sister without without clothes and daily food, walks up to them, sees them, and then says to them these words, go in peace. First, go in peace is a classic biblical greeting. If you go to some churches at the end, after the benediction, right, if they have one, they'll say, go in peace. It is a biblical farewell that is given often throughout Scripture and in the church. It is saying, on your way, may the peace of God bless you. So this person sees the person in need and then says, go in peace. In the name of God, may the peace of God be with you, even though I recognize you don't have any food and or clothes. And then you say to that person, be warmed and be filled. The verbs here in the Greek can either be in the middle voice or in the passive voice. If it's in the middle voice, it means warm yourself and fill yourself. Go and figure out, as you go in peace, how to warm yourself and feed yourself. If it's in the passive voice, it's pointing to God's action, usually in the Greek, and it means, as you go in peace, may God warm you and feed you. That's his responsibility, not mine. Bye. Situation is pretty clear. You see the need, enough to recommend or advise them to go get warm and get fed, aka you recognize they're not warm and they're not fed. You also know that they do not have the means to do so, and yet you do nothing to meet their needs. And James is saying, if that is the situation, what good does that do? What use is it to that poor person? What does it profit that person? And the answer in this rhetorical style of questioning is simple: nothing. And so he says, so likewise, then a faith without works in this type of way is dead. That type of faith that would see, recognize, acknowledge, and even speak to the need but do nothing about it is not a living faith. It is dead and therefore no good. Now, let's take a moment to let that kind of sink in a bit. But let's do it maybe a little bit differently than maybe we normally ought to. I think normally in this situation, the way that we generally deal with a text like this is go, what would I do in that situation, right? If I approach, and if this was my situation and I did that, what would I do? Would I dare not do anything? Would I speak to it, yada, 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 so on and so forth? Would I just walk by? Maybe I didn't notice, so on and so forth. But I think to do that might not be the best way. Let us consider it from a different angle. An angle we considered last week, in which James says, loving your neighbor as yourself. Maybe it's helpful if we look at it and we place ourselves in the position and in the shoes, if you will, of the poor brother and sister. And as a poor brother and sister in need of daily food and warm clothes, a other fellow brother or sister, a Christian, walks up to you, sees you, recognizes you, acknowledges you, addresses you, and then does nothing about it. What would I feel about that person's faith? Now, I'm not suggesting that we go around judging other people's faith. That's not the suggestion at all. But when you put it in that, when you flip the tables around, then all of a sudden, things start to change a little bit the way that we see it. Would we be able to say a person like that, that person's faith is genuine or one that saves? And I think we would say, probably not. Why? Because there's no proof. As they say, it's all smoke but no fire, all bark but no bite, all talk but no walk. Or my favorite, the proof simply ain't in the pudding. It may look like pudding, it may smell like pudding, it may even feel like pudding, but it sure don't taste like pudding. This is fake and bacon at its finest. Now, as James kind of does this, I do this a lot, but someone might say, well, Pastor Pete, you just never know. And how are you to know? And that is indeed true. We do not know definitively. But James gives us a little clue that though we may not know definitively, right, 100%, there are indeed ways to show your faith or show proof of something that's going on in your life, right? There are definitive ways to show. Like, we can excuse a one-time thing. It was a rough day, maybe. We weren't having a good day. Our headspace was all, like, everything was going wrong that day, and so maybe we just didn't see it. We didn't recognize it. But James is not addressing a one-off thing, to be clear, because this is happening regularly enough, and it is a big of a problem that he would write it in this letter to all of the Christians dispersed among the nations. And so this situation, he's speaking of a person in which this is a pattern, a characteristic behavior of this person. And so in this case, I think we can say that there are indeed ways to know or to show the fruit or the proof of the pudding, if you will. For example, if someone claims to you that they've been working out in the gym all the time, I think you would expect to be able to see signs of that working out. Either their body's going to change and or they're going to get really strong, one or the other, or maybe both. Right? And without that, you'd go, I don't know if they're really going to the gym. Like, I mean, you say you do, but there's ways to show. And I know this firsthand. My lovely wife, Christina, she's been working out for quite a while now, getting in shape, getting strong, doing all that stuff. She was doing like high-intensity interval training for a little while, and then she all of a sudden started lifting weights. So she's getting a little muscular. And so I know this because I helped design her workout program. So I know what she's doing, and she tracks her weights and all that kind of stuff. It's a little nerdy, but that's what she's doing, and it's pretty cool in my opinion. But I knew that she had gotten stronger like this, because there's ways to show. Every weekend, as you may know, at this point, it's football season, so we go to Connor's football game. We as a family were responsible. We volunteered to bring water bottles, a little squeeze one, so we fill up 6 or 7 of those, right, with water so that the team can have water. Then we fill it up with ice, and we put other stuff in there so it stays cold. Mason is the water boy of the team, so he walks up and down the sideline with a cooler, and then he squeezes water into the player's mouth while they have the helmets on. Anyways, we do this, okay? So we go, and we load it up into the minivan, do all that stuff, and then we take it to the game. One weekend, we were late, a little bit late. I'm one of the coaches, and so I wanted to make sure Connor gets on the field really quickly. So we got to the parking lot, and I'm like in a rush being like, I want to get Connor to the game, so on and so forth. And then as I'm leaving, and I'm like, Connor, let's go, we got to go. I grab my clipboard, whatever. We're going. I all of a sudden see the cooler out of the corner of my eye. Now, chivalry is not dead, and I think we should be, So I'm like, oh shit, I got to get the cooler, right? Water bottles, ice, it's got all bunch of stuff in it. I got to get the cooler, get it out of the car at least so she can wheel it. And then in that moment, I realized, no, I don't. Because I know how much she lifts. That cooler is not as heavy as the weight she lifts on a daily basis. So I don't need to help her at all. She's got this. She's totally cool. You know what? I can go. I've seen her lift so many more heavier things. So as I'm going, I do the calculation. I'm going, honey, I got to go. You take her the cooler. I know you're strong enough. Bye. And then she goes, cool, bye. And it just lifts it up and it's no problem. Why? Because she's been doing the work. There are indeed ways to show that you have been doing the work. Silly example, but there's ways to know whether faith or these kinds of things are genuine. And what James is saying, this person in this situation is not genuine. Their words don't match. But James isn't quite done, because he gives a very critical clue as to how we can then understand this more clearly. Because in verse 17 he says, even so, faith without no works is dead by itself. By itself. Faith by itself without works, aka, is dead. You see, what he's pointing at is this very simple thing that happens then, that happened then, and that happens now. People in those days, and again, today too, had a tendency to want to treat faith and works as very separate things. Because works is kind of the difficult part in some ways. They wanted to separate them and treat them as two totally independent and mutually exclusive things. And James is saying, no, that just cannot be it. The way to understand it is like this. Today in the church we'll say this, and this is a good thing, but we'll say every Christian in this room, in this body, has a gifting and a calling. Some are gifted in hospitality, others in praise, others in service, others in generosity. And we see this, right? Praise team, wonderful, gifted in worship and musicality. And then we have a hospitality team, wonderful in their serving. Not everybody's called to both, and not everybody's gifted in both. So if each one has their unique calling and gifting, as long as everybody is fulfilling their gifting and calling, then we as the body, we're very good. Paul calls this the body theology in 1 Corinthians, right? Everyone's a part of the body, everyone has a unique portion, they play the portion, and the body is whole and good. Now, while that is true, people in the day, and even today I would say, would then go, well, this is how faith and works work. I have faith and some other people have work. As long as I have the faith and those people have the works, then as long as we independently do it together, then we're good. And James says, no, that's not how this works. Faith and works, they go together. They cannot be separate. Or maybe the best way to put it is simply faith includes the works. One without the other in either direction is dead. And to be clear, James is not, as some have suggested, against faith and all about works. He's not like, hey, faith is not necessary, it's only works. No. Chapter 2, verse 1, I don't have it on the screen. He says what? Hold your faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, right, a certain way. Don't be impartial to those. And then in verse 5 of chapter 2, he says, God chooses the poor. Why? To be rich in their faith. Throughout James, he makes it clear, faith is the bedrock. It's the basis of those who are rich in their faith, who fulfill the law, who love others as they love themselves, who considers trials joy, who are quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. All of that is based on the faith that is given as God births in us a new life. If you remember, one of James's main arguments is that a genuine faith must make a difference in the life of a believer. But it starts with faith. But the impact and the difference it makes is the works. Faith and works go hand in hand. They go together. What James is comparing, I have a quote, but we won't go over it. Actually, it's kind of long, and we'll just go bypass it. Basically, what James is arguing is that what he's contrasting is a dead or defective faith that does not produce works versus a effective and alive faith that does produce works. They go together. So he's asking, as you look at your faith, brother and or sister, which is it? Is your faith one that works, or is it one that does not work? Now, as you can probably guess, this is a heavy topic. It's not one that we'd like to engage in with anybody, right? It's not one we'd like to talk about with folks, if we're being honest. And so James then goes to say, hey, I know what I've said is pretty strong, so let me illustrate for you why I believe what I believe. And these 4 illustrations are really, really helpful. He starts laying them out in a very nerdy way that helps us why and prove what he's trying to say. Here are the 4 illustrations. They work this way. Don't mind the nerdiness. It's a structure. So the four illustrations are this. The first illustration, A, he illustrates a fake faith that's ineffective in relation to other people, right? That's the Christian who oppresses the poor and does nothing. A prime, as the contrast to it at the bottom of the section, is a genuine faith that is effective in relation to others. And he talks about Rahab and her treatment of the spies and the people of Canaan. B, in the middle, the center part of the argument, is first a fake faith that is ineffective in relation to God. That's the demons who believe and shudder. And then B prime is the genuine faith that's effective in relation to God, and that's Abraham and what he does with Isaac. What James is saying is, let me make it absolutely clear for you. If you want to know the true definition of faith and a faith that works, look at these examples so that you don't get off track. And so let's break these down, shall we? A and A prime are linked because it is the Christian's lack of action towards the poor versus Rahab's clear and definitive action towards the poor, which in this situation is the Jewish spies. We also know they're linked because James calls both in situations a faith without works is dead. He uses that language. B and B prime are linked because of the word believe. He first says to the Christian, you believe that God is one, good for you. But the demons also believe, and they shudder. And then later on he says, Abraham believed, and then it was credited to him as righteousness. And then the contrast you have, clearly, is a belief that ends in shuddering and a belief that ends in being a friend of God. So do you see the difference? So then let's break it down a little further. If you break down A and A prime, then, what James is wanting to do is to compare and to contrast this. One is a faith that sees the need and does nothing, even though the solution and the remedy is clear as day. Contrasting with Rahab's faith, whose faith takes everything she has, puts it on the line to help and rescue the poor, which in this case are the Jewish spies who are in grave danger. Contrast the faith and see which one is alive and dead, James says. Now, let me give you a quick summary of the story in Joshua chapter 2, so you kind of have an idea. Before Israel enters the promised land, and they're about to go into Canaan, they send two spies, or a few spies, to spy out the land to figure out what they're going up against. And the spies, unfortunately, are the most terrible spies in the world because they immediately get spotted out. Canaan knows, and then they go, and they're like, all right, we got to catch those guys. And so what do? They go to Rahab's house. And immediately, Rahab springs into action to save these spies. She does so because earlier she mentions she's heard of Yahweh. She realized that she's got to side with Yahweh and his people and this God because why? The Canaanites, well, they're just dead meat. They're not going to make it, just like everyone else has gotten steamrolled by Yahweh in this journey. So what she do? She hides the spies, and then when the Canaanite officials come, she lies to them and says, nope, I don't know what you're talking about, they're not here, and then she gives up a plan, and then she tells the spies, and the spies, they escape, and they get back home safely. Rahab's faith puts everything on the line, her house, her resources, her personal life and safety to help the spies who in that situation were in desperate need of help. And James says clearly, Rahab's faith, especially in contrast with the Christian brother who sees, or sister who sees another and does not do anything even though they see the need, Rahab's is a living faith because it acts and it works and it does and it moves. The other is dead. Why? Because it's like a body without a spirit and or soul. It's dead. Faith without proof or faith without works that lives out such faith, James says, is likewise dead. Like a body that must have a spirit and or a soul to be alive, a faith must have works to be alive. Pretty simple and clear and once you break it down. And then B and B prime. Some might contend, as they did then, and some might contend now, and they might say, hey, but James or Pastor Pete, I believe, I have faith. And who are you to tell me, or who is anyone for that matter, to tell me that I do not? And if this is the argument, it's a fair one. Because we actually can't and be certain. But James's counter is quite brilliant because it makes, again, you look at yourself and see. He says in verse 19 then, okay, well, if that's what you're going to say, well, here, let me say this to you. He goes, you believe that God is one? Good, you do well. In those days, God being the Trinity, three and yet one and yet three, was a big issue. That's why the creeds were written, to make sure that everyone understood God's mysterious Trinitarian self. Jesus being God himself was also a big issue. So God being one was a fundamental belief that people had to hold on to, and not everybody agreed that God is a Trinitarian God and Jesus is also God. And so James is saying, you believe that God is one? Good for you. That's really great. I mean that. But have you considered, so do the demons believe that God is one. In Jesus' time, throughout the Gospels, there are multiple instances where the demons, sometimes better than the disciples even, recognize that Jesus is God. Right? But what does James say? In those situations, what does that belief get the demons? Well, they shudder, he says. That word in the Greek is used this time and this time only, and it means to react in paralyzing, frantic, and frenzied fear that results in animosity. It's so much fear and faith that you hate the person that you fear. And I think we can agree, if that's the result of this belief, then that result is no good. It's not what we would call a genuine faith in God. Why? Because a faith in God, right, birthed anew by His Word, where the Word of God is implanted into our hearts, right? We talked about transplants, right, where a heart of stone gets taken out and then a heart of flesh gets put in. How could such a faith result in hatred and animosity towards the God who did the transplant work? Would such a faith birthed anew cause that kind of animosity? Of course not. So then James says, then that faith without the works is useless in verse 20. He's actually utilizing a pun. He's saying the faith without the works is workless, aka it doesn't have the works, therefore it's workless, therefore it doesn't work. And then he contrasts it with Abraham, who believed God and was called a friend of God. And James is saying this is how it's supposed to work, is it not? True faith means that we are loved, made rich in faith, made heirs to the kingdom, and therefore friends of God. And if you contrast it, it's pretty clear. Demons, they believe, they end up in fear. Abraham, he believed, it ended up in friendship. But then he takes it, as he tends to do, one step further, and we can't overlook the specific example of Abraham's faith-filled life that James points to. Oh, we're going too far. Here we go. There we go. James then goes to explain about Abraham's incident with Isaac. If you've been in the church a long time, you know this story. Throughout Abraham's life, clearly he had faith, and he showed it. But this incident, James points to as the one, perhaps, that really, really cemented that he had faith. The word credited is used. It's like a seal of approval. Though his faith existed, this was perhaps the proof of the pudding that he was willing to sacrifice his beloved son. Now we have to ask, why is this so important? Well, we discussed this at Worship at the Park, but to be brief, Abraham believed that God was going to save his son no matter what. When he's at the bottom of the mountain, he tells his servants, we, my son and I, are going to go up to the mountain, we are going to worship, and we are going to come back. He believes that the entire time that we are together, that this is a plural kind of action. And we later find out in Hebrews, right, that he believed that God could raise his son from the dead, and therefore he knew that he could believe God, trust him, and carry out his action and sacrifice his son, and God was going to go ahead and come through clutch in the end. But what this does, and what James is pointing to, is this emphatically, I think we would all agree that if Abraham was willing to do this, he even took out the knife and he was this close to doing so, it emphatically proves that indeed Abraham had faith, and that faith was willing to work. It's why James says very clearly, you want to show me your faith that doesn't have works? I'll show you my faith by my works. This is how it works. So now that we've laid out the argument, what does this mean for us? Now, before we get into the implications, and there's 4 of them, I want to kind of set the tone, because I recognize that this passage is a difficult one. I prayed a lot this week about this passage and how to preach it and do all these things. Because the last thing that I want for this passage to do is to help us to divide in here, judge others, and do all these things. Let me make it clear. James is not trying to do that at all. This is supposed to be an introspective look at our faith and whether we indeed have a faith that works. But also, let me say, as we get into these implications, This is not meant to be a burden. I truly do mean that. It is challenging to be certain, but not burdensome. Because in the end, it is not about our doing the works, but God producing the works in us. And I hope you will see that in the long run. But I hope that as we get to these implications of what it means, that we'll place ourselves in a proper posture to really hear the implications and what it means and why. So let's get to the implications, shall we? 4 of them. First, by using Rahab and Abraham as the examples of a faith that works, what James is saying is that no one in the entire world is exempt or outside the bounds of a faith that works. AKA, if you're a Christian, you have to have a faith that works. Now, the reason why this is the case is because Rahab and Abraham are 2 people on polar opposite ends of the life spectrum in every way. Rahab is a woman. She's a foreigner. She's a prostitute, aka not of high character. Abraham, on the other hand, is a man. He's a Jew. He's a father of faith, man of high character. So the example is supposed to be very clear that these 2 people are on literal opposite ends of the spectrum. And what James is doing by using these 2 examples is saying that no matter where you are in life, no matter what you find yourself in, you will fit somewhere within these 2 extremes. All faith for all Christians must include work. It must be a faith that works. Faith that is birthed anew by Christ, indeed, will work. It includes all. But also, implication number 2, by concluding the section on the love and the poor with the discussion with faith and works, what James is saying then is not only does it include all Christians and must their faith that works be for all, he's saying a faith that works without a shadow of a doubt must include a care and a love for the poor. If works, say, was a portfolio, right? Like an artist has a portfolio, then this work portfolio, if you will include many different types of things, but one of the things it must include to prove that that faith is genuine is care for the poor. If a care and a love for the poor and the needy is not a part of our works portfolio, if you will, then we might need to think a bit about our faith and whether indeed is one that works. And the third implication, and this is the important one maybe, well then is how much do we extend this example into our lives as it pertains to meeting the needs of the poor? Now this is an important question, especially in our day, because with the news and the internet and everything that we have, we see and we know of so much more need than we've ever before, right? Like with everything that's happening, right? With the Hamas and all those stuff, and then we had another crazy shooting at, is it Massachusetts or Maine? Like, we know of need and poor and stricken people all over, so much more than we've ever known. And so we got to ask, how much and to what extent? Because clearly, we as individuals cannot meet all of these needs, right? So to what extent? Now, I will not give you anything definitive, because to me, that is God's work in your heart and the Spirit's leading of you. But I will say this, and I think this is important. How much? I'd venture to say that probably for most, if not all of us, the extent to which we are meeting this need for the poor and the helpless, we probably ought to do just a little bit more than what we're doing. That's probably how much. Why? Because as God continually sanctifies us, draws us in, and continually makes us more like Him, I believe that we will produce more and more fruit, more works, if you will. So I think it's healthy for us to be in a mindset that says a bit more than what I'm doing now. I'm reminded of a pastor in England. I can't remember his name. I just heard this example in seminary. I'll never forget it. When he first started his church, he got, like, let's say 30K. That's a made-up number. It doesn't really matter what the number is. And then as his church grew, and it became one of the largest churches in the UK, apparently, he vowed to only take 30K, to live off of that and to give the rest. He continued to strive to do more, to produce more. Not that that's what really matters, but that attitude. So what it specifically means for you, I do not know, but I think we might want to consider that maybe a bit more than what I'm doing is the attitude and the posture. But still, let me leave you with this third implication and this quote. It's not on the screen. It was too long to put it on there, but it's a quote by a theologian. And it just makes us think. It's a little outdated, the quote, because of what his examples, but I think you'll get the point. And with a little bit more attitude, and then with this quote, I hope you will find where God might be calling you in terms of your extent to how much God is calling you to do or to work or to show your faith. He says this: we should be relentless in pushing governments and pushing church leaders who have the opportunity to address world governments in a significant way, to throw both economic and military caution to the winds in the face of the prior claims of human need. Meat mountains, butter mountains, and powdered milk mountains are an offense to God and man if there's a hungry mouth in the world that can be filled through them. The preempting of the world's wealth for weapons of mass destruction, whether conventional or nuclear, is blasphemy against the living God, while those to whom he has given life die for want of food or medical care. Even if the millions of money that go out through voluntary relief organizations pale into insignificance beside what governments can do. I provide that for you just as a way for us to think about maybe what God is calling us to in the world. Then the last implication, and the question that we have to leave with and consider is, okay, Pastor Pete, James, how? How do we do all of this? Because the standards are so high, right? You told me it wasn't going to be burdensome. How? I feel very burdened right now, maybe you're thinking. Because I cannot, in my current situation, whatever it is, I cannot meet all these needs. How? Well, the answer, I think emphatically, James will say, is not by working harder. It's not by trying harder. I think the answer is what he's been saying throughout this entire book and what the gospel reflects. The answer to how we meet the standard, to me, is simply look intently at Jesus. We said it a couple weeks ago, it is to receive his love. Be poor that is made rich in faith. Be made wise, you foolish ones. Be birthed anew and live out by the implanting of his word a faith-filled life. And the reason why we end here and the reason why this is the solution is because I don't think it's a coincidence that James uses Rahab and Abraham as the example. He's not just doing it to put burden on us. Because if you just end with Rahab and Abraham and follow their examples, then you go, well, I got to be like Rahab, I got to be like Abraham. That's impossible. And I hope that no one in here ever gets into a situation where they have to rescue, Christian spies from like enemies, right? And then risk your life, or have to sacrifice one of your children, right? Because God asked you to. I hope nobody ever gets there. And I don't think anybody will, I hope. But if they are the examples and we're supposed to look up to them, this is never going to work because you're always going to feel like you don't come through and there's not enough. But why does he then use those examples? Because that's how it ends up making us feel. It's because in those two examples, maybe better than many other examples in the scriptures, it points to the work and the actions of God and Jesus unlike any other example may be. Have you considered? What did Rahab do? Rahab, at the cost of almost everything, risked everything and put on the line to help the poor and the needy. Abraham, when asked to offer and sacrifice his son, almost got there and was going to do so. Who does that better than Rahab and Abraham? Only one person, and that is our God. God the Father, who sends his son to sacrifice his son, but doesn't just almost get there, actually does, turning his face away to sacrifice his son. And then a Jesus who goes and risks not risk everything, but literally lays his life on the line, takes it to save the poor and the needy. If you receive that, look intently at that always, then you'll want and desire, I truly believe, to live a faith that works. It's not burdensome. Receive it and then live it. Hear the gospel, receive the word, and then live it. Follow after him because he is indeed good. If you do, then you'll live out a faith that works. And in doing, you'll participate in the glorious work of the kingdom. And if you do, then more and more you'll fall in love with our God, which will then lead to a life that is indeed faithful and worksful, if you will. So how do you live out this faith and work? You look, you listen, and then you live. You look at the God who's already done it all. You listen to his words and his wisdom and his encouragement, and then you live it out by his Spirit. Church, I pray and I hope that indeed you will be men and women of faith that works. Because you look at the God who's already done the work, and then you live out the works that he's already done in you. And in doing so, may you be blessed, and may the world then know that he is God and and he is king. So as we get ready to sing and worship together, will you take a moment and ask, Lord, my faith, is it one that works? Is it one that is working? Is it one that is alive? And if you feel that maybe it isn't, then this is when we really repent and go before God and you say, not that I've done less or I need to do more, but God, would you show me your love in the work of your Son? And in doing so, then move me closer to you so that I can live out this life. And then as you do, church, may you be blessed to receive the faith and then live out that faith in the works that changes the world. So take some time to pray, and then we'll begin and sing in response.